It's just a chair. You can stand. Linda's voice carried lightly across the dining room, bright and amused, as if she had just made an innocent joke instead of a public correction. Daniel chuckled under his breath, not quite meeting his mother's eyes. Margaret Collins stood at the head of the long oak table in the house she had lived in for 27 years, her fingers resting gently on the carved back of the chair that had always been hers. The chandelier above cast a warm yellow glow over the polished hardwood floors, over the crystal glasses she had taken out for this dinner, over the roast chicken she had spent 3 hours preparing. She did not argue. She did not sigh. She simply straightened her shoulders and stepped aside, allowing Linda to slide into the seat without hesitation. The rest of the family watched with the careful stillness people use when they sense something uncomfortable but choose not to interfere. Margaret remained standing for a moment longer than necessary, her hands still touching the wood, as if confirming it was real. The house measured 3,200 square feet, built in 1996, refinished twice, repainted in soft coastal gray just last spring. Every mortgage payment had cleared from her checking account on the first of the month, even after Robert passed away last year. She remembered signing the final refinance papers at the kitchen island, Robert squeezing her hand and saying, "This place will always be yours." After his funeral, Daniel and Linda had moved in temporarily, bringing with them matching luggage sets and promises to help her adjust. At first it had seemed considerate. They rearranged the pantry, claiming it would make cooking easier. They replaced the Wi-Fi password for security reasons. They converted Robert's study into a home office for Daniel's remote consulting job. Margaret had told herself that change was natural. Children grew up. Houses shifted. But tonight, as she remained on her feet while everyone else settled into their plates, she felt something else settling too. A pattern. Linda passed the mashed potatoes to Daniel before offering them to anyone else. Daniel thanked his wife and complimented the seasoning, though it was Margaret's recipe from a church cookbook printed in 1988. Margaret reached for her water glass, her movements precise, unhurried. No one invited her to sit. No one offered to switch places. Outside, the late October wind brushed against the maple trees lining the driveway, leaves scraping lightly against the siding. The thermostat clicked on, steady at 70 degrees, the same setting Margaret had kept for years. She looked around the dining room at the framed family photos still hanging exactly where she had placed them. Daniel at age 8 holding a Little League trophy, Robert in his navy blazer at their 30th anniversary party, Margaret herself smiling beside a Christmas tree taller than the doorway. She had paid the property taxes. She had signed the insurance renewals. She had kept the deed in a locked fireproof box upstairs. "It's just a chair," Linda repeated lightly, spearing a green bean. Margaret finally pulled out a smaller dining chair from against the wall and positioned it near the corner of the table, not at the head. She lowered herself into it calmly, smoothing the fabric of her navy cardigan. She did not correct anyone. She did not defend her place. But as she folded her napkin across her lap, something steady moved behind her composed expression. The candles continued to burn. The dinner plates clinked softly, and Margaret Collins, seated in the corner of her own dining room, began to understand exactly where she stood. The dinner ended the way uncomfortable dinners often do, with polite compliments and the scraping of forks against china, but something had shifted in the quiet spaces between words. After the plates were cleared, Linda disappeared into the living room with her phone, her laughter light and bright as she described the evening to someone on speaker. Daniel stood at the sink rinsing dishes that Margaret had already washed by hand for decades, water running longer than necessary. Margaret gathered the folded cloth napkins and stacked them neatly, pressing each crease with careful fingers. She moved through her kitchen the way she always had, counting small details without appearing to do so. The refrigerator hummed at the same steady pitch. The clock above the stove read 8:23. Outside, the porch light cast a soft circle onto the driveway Robert had sealed himself every other summer. Nothing looked different, and yet everything felt recalibrated. Over the past 12 months since Robert passed away, Daniel and Linda had slowly adjusted the rhythm of the house. It began with suggestions. They recommended installing a smart thermostat, saying it would reduce energy costs. They rearranged the hallway closet so that their coats occupied the lower hooks while Margaret's winter wool coat was moved to the far end. They offered to handle the mail, explaining that online statements were more efficient. Margaret had appreciated the help at first. Grief had made ordinary tasks feel heavier, and Daniel had sounded so certain when he said, "Let us take care of things, Mom." But somewhere along the way, taking care of things had turned into taking control. Margaret noticed that the property tax envelope never reached her hands that year. Daniel mentioned he had already paid it electronically. The homeowner's insurance renewal confirmation arrived by email, though Margaret had always preferred printed copies. When she asked casually about the annual maintenance contract for the heating system, Linda replied that she had switched companies because the old one was overpriced. Each decision was explained as practical, modern, efficient. Margaret did not object. She observed. She began to keep quiet notes in her mind. The garage code changed in March. The backyard landscaping was scheduled without her input in May. The dining room chairs were reupholstered in June in a shade of beige that did not match the curtains she had chosen with Robert years ago. By late summer, Margaret felt like a visitor moving through rooms that still carried her memories but no longer responded to her voice. She still paid the electric bill from her account. She still covered the water and trash service. Yet the language in the house had shifted. Daniel spoke of upgrades. Linda spoke of resale value. Margaret heard phrases that did not sit comfortably. When we renovate. When we decide. When we list. That last word lingered in her thoughts long after the dishes were dried and placed back into their cabinets. That evening, after everyone retreated to their rooms, Margaret walked slowly down the hallway toward the master bedroom she had shared with Robert for 41 years. She paused in front of the closed door to Robert's old study, now Daniel's office, and listened to the faint tapping of computer keys. She did not knock. Instead, she continued to her room and opened the bottom drawer of her dresser where she kept a small brass key attached to a faded ribbon. She held it in her palm for a moment, feeling its cool weight. Then she placed it back and closed the drawer gently. She did not need to rush. She only needed to remember exactly what belonged to her and exactly what did not. In the weeks that followed, Margaret began to notice how language in the house shifted from suggestion to assumption. One Saturday morning, she walked into the kitchen to find blueprints spread across the island where she once rolled pie dough every Thanksgiving. Linda stood over them with a cup of coffee, tracing lines with the tip of her finger. Daniel leaned against the counter, nodding as she spoke about open floor plans and increasing natural light. They did not stop when Margaret entered. They simply adjusted their tone. Linda smiled politely and said they were only exploring ideas for the future. Margaret glanced at the sketches and saw the dining room wall marked for removal. The dining room, the same room where Robert had insisted on solid oak beams when the house was first built. She did not ask why her opinion had not been requested. She only poured herself a glass of water and listened. Later that afternoon, as she passed the hallway, she heard Linda speaking softly on the phone. The words were not meant for Margaret, yet the house carried sound easily. Linda mentioned market timing and competitive offers. She said the neighborhood was trending upward and that inventory was limited. Margaret paused near the linen closet, her hand resting on a folded stack of towels. The conversation continued with a sentence that made the air feel thinner. Once we get it listed, it should move quickly. Get it listed. Margaret did not step into the hallway. She did not clear her throat. She waited until the call ended and then walked calmly into the living room where Linda sat scrolling through her phone. Listed? Margaret asked lightly, as though she were discussing a grocery item. Linda blinked and laughed, dismissing the question as a misunderstanding. She explained they were only discussing hypothetical scenarios, that Daniel had always dreamed of relocating closer to the city, that nothing was final. Daniel entered from the garage at that moment, carrying a small stack of mail. When Margaret looked at him, he avoided her eyes and began talking about interest rates. The conversation drifted into numbers and percentages, into equity and timing, into language that made Margaret feel like an outsider in her own home. That evening, she returned to her bedroom and opened the bottom drawer again. She lifted the brass key and walked to the closet where a small fireproof safe rested behind neatly arranged shoeboxes. She unlocked it slowly and removed a thick folder labeled in Robert's careful handwriting. Inside were documents she had not reviewed in months. The deed bore her name clearly, sole owner. Beneath it, another document lay signed and dated 8 months ago. A lease agreement. Daniel's signature appeared on the final page in blue ink. 12 months, renewable upon mutual agreement. Margaret sat on the edge of her bed and read every line twice. The terms were specific. The boundaries were clear. For the first time in weeks, she felt the ground steady beneath her feet. She closed the folder, returned it to the safe, and locked it without hurry. Down the hallway, she could hear Linda laughing again, already discussing paint samples with someone else. Margaret folded her hands in her lap and allowed a small, almost invisible smile to form. She did not need to argue about walls or renovations. She only needed to wait for the right moment to remind everyone exactly whose name was written where it mattered. The following Sunday arrived with the quiet predictability of routine, sunlight stretching across the dining room floor in long golden lines that touched the same oak planks Robert had once polished himself. Margaret woke before anyone else, as she always did, and brewed a full pot of coffee, even though she knew Daniel preferred a single cup from his machine. The house felt almost peaceful in the early morning, before conversations about value and renovation began again. She carried her mug to the back patio and sat in the wicker chair Robert had insisted on buying during a summer clearance sale 15 years ago. The air measured 58 degrees, cool enough to require her light cardigan. She watched the maple leaves shift in the breeze and allowed herself to remember the first day they had moved into the house. Robert had stood in the empty living room, hands on his hips, smiling like a man who had just secured something solid for his family. He had spoken about stability, about roots, about giving Daniel a foundation that could not be shaken by trends or markets. Margaret remembered signing the original mortgage documents beside him at a folding table because the furniture had not yet arrived. She remembered mailing the final payment nearly 2 decades later, sealing the envelope with careful satisfaction. The house was never an investment strategy to her. It was a timeline written in drywall and hardwood. As the morning unfolded, Daniel and Linda emerged with casual conversation about paint swatches and weekend appointments. Linda mentioned that a real estate agent friend had offered to stop by later in the week just to evaluate potential. She used the word lightly, as though it carried no weight. Daniel added that it would be wise to understand their options, especially with interest rates fluctuating. Margaret listened without interrupting. She stirred her coffee slowly and nodded at appropriate moments. She noticed how neither of them asked whether she had plans for the week. She noticed how the phrase "their options" slipped easily into the discussion, replacing what had once been "our home." After breakfast, Linda placed a small stack of printed listings on the kitchen counter, comparable homes in nearby neighborhoods. Margaret picked one up and studied the photograph of a staged living room, beige and bright, with no personal photographs on the walls. The description emphasized updated finishes and resale appeal. Margaret set the paper back down carefully. Later that afternoon, she walked through each room of her house alone. She paused in the hallway where pencil marks still recorded Daniel's height at ages 6, 10, and 14. She ran her fingers along the mantel where Robert had once mismeasured a bracket and laughed about it for years. She stood again at the head of the dining table, the same chair that had been quietly reassigned days before. The room looked unchanged, yet the atmosphere felt provisional, as though decisions were being made in corners without her consent. Margaret did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. Instead, she returned to her bedroom and retrieved the brass key once more. She opened the safe, removed the lease agreement, and placed it on the nightstand where she could see it clearly. She read Daniel's signature again, steady and unmistakable. 11 months remained on the contract. Terms clearly stated occupancy rights and conditions of use. Margaret folded the document neatly and placed it into a simple manila envelope. She did not need to rehearse what she would say. She only needed to wait until the next time someone suggested that her place at the table was optional. Thursday evening arrived with a different kind of energy in the house, the kind that hums just beneath the surface before a storm. Margaret noticed at the moment she walked into the kitchen and found a stranger's business card resting neatly beside the fruit bowl. The card was thick, embossed, professional. A real estate agent. Daniel stood near the refrigerator, explaining in a tone that sounded rehearsed that it was only an informational visit. Linda added that it never hurt to be prepared, especially in a market where homes in their zip code were averaging over $600,000. Margaret listened while placing a pot of soup on the stove, the scent of thyme and bay leaf rising slowly into the air. She asked one simple question. When is the appointment? Daniel hesitated before answering. Tomorrow afternoon at 3. Margaret nodded and stirred the soup in steady circles. 3 o'clock had once been the hour she picked Daniel up from elementary school. She remembered waiting in the carpool line in winter weather, heater running, watching him run toward the car with a backpack too large for his shoulders. Now he was discussing square footage and equity as though she were not part of the structure itself. The next day, Margaret remained home. She dressed carefully in a pressed blouse and dark slacks, not to impress anyone, but to remind herself who she was. At precisely 3 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Linda greeted the agent with enthusiastic warmth, guiding her through the foyer and into the living room. Daniel followed, pointing out updates and features. Margaret stood near the staircase, listening to the agent compliment the natural light and the layout. Words like potential and desirable floated easily through the air. When the agent stepped into the dining room, she paused at the head of the table. She remarked that buyers often appreciate a defined focal point in a room like this. Linda laughed lightly and said they were open to reimagining the space entirely. Margaret walked forward then, her steps unhurried. She rested her hand once more on the back of the oak chair at the head of the table. The wood felt solid beneath her palm. The agent smiled politely and asked if the house was jointly owned. Daniel opened his mouth to answer, but Margaret spoke first. It is solely in my name. The agent's expression shifted slightly, just enough to register surprise. Linda glanced toward Daniel, confusion flickering across her face. Margaret continued in the same calm tone. I have not authorized any listing. The room grew quiet in a way that felt heavier than before. The agent cleared her throat and closed her folder gently. She explained that she would be happy to return if and when the legal owner wished to proceed. Within minutes, she excused herself. The front door closed with a soft click that echoed down the hallway. Linda turned toward Daniel with visible frustration, asking why this had not been clarified. Daniel looked at his mother, something uncertain moving across his features. Margaret did not raise her voice. She did not accuse them of overstepping. She simply walked to the kitchen, turned off the stove, and ladled soup into 3 bowls as though dinner had always been the only plan for the evening. The lease agreement remained upstairs in its envelope, untouched. She did not need to use it yet. She had only needed to remind them that assumptions were not ownership, and that preparation without permission was simply imagination. The house remained unusually quiet the morning after the agent's visit, as if the walls themselves were absorbing what had almost happened. Daniel left early for a meeting downtown, his footsteps heavier than usual as he moved through the hallway. Linda stayed in the kitchen longer than necessary, reorganizing cabinets that did not need reorganizing. Margaret watched from the breakfast nook, a legal pad resting beside her coffee cup. She had begun writing things down, not accusations, not complaints, just dates and phrases. 3 o'clock appointment without notice. Discussion of listing prior to ownership confirmation. Change of language from help to control. The act of writing steadied her. She had learned long ago that clarity was more powerful than confrontation. Around mid-morning, Linda approached the table with a softened expression. She said they had only been thinking about the future, that Daniel worried about Margaret managing such a large property alone. Margaret listened carefully. She did not dispute the concern. Instead, she asked a simple question. When you say alone, what do you mean? Linda hesitated, then replied that it was practical to consider downsizing at Margaret's age. The word age lingered in the air longer than the others. Margaret folded her hands on top of the legal pad and studied her daughter-in-law's face. She noticed how confidently Linda spoke about square footage and resale value, how easily she framed change as protection. Margaret thought about the lease upstairs, about the signature Daniel had placed on the final page without hesitation 8 months earlier when he said it would be simpler that way, just paperwork to formalize temporary support. Temporary had a clear definition. Margaret rose from the table and walked to the hallway closet where a framed photograph of Robert hung slightly crooked. She adjusted it gently, aligning it with the edge of the doorframe. Linda followed her, continuing to speak about financial responsibility and planning ahead. Margaret turned slowly and said that planning required respect for existing agreements. Linda's expression shifted, cautious now. Margaret returned to the kitchen and picked up her legal pad. She read aloud the terms she had written in her own handwriting. 12-month residential lease. Rent amount clearly specified. Occupancy rights limited to designated areas. No alterations without written consent of owner. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse anyone of overstepping. She simply asked whether those conditions were still understood. Linda blinked, processing the reminder. Daniel arrived home shortly after noon, tension visible in the way he placed his briefcase on the counter. Margaret invited him to sit. She repeated the same language, steady and precise. Daniel's shoulders dropped slightly as realization settled in. He nodded slowly, acknowledging that the agreement remained valid. Margaret allowed silence to follow. Silence carried weight when filled with facts. She closed the legal pad and placed it beside her coffee cup. Outside, a delivery truck passed, its engine rumbling briefly before fading away. Inside, the house felt steadier. Margaret did not threaten eviction. She did not mention consequences. She only clarified boundaries. The distinction was subtle but unmistakable. For the first time in weeks, Daniel avoided phrases about resale and renovation. Linda excused herself to the laundry room without further argument. Margaret remained seated at the table for several minutes after they dispersed, listening to the familiar hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of the clock. Agreements, she reminded herself, were not emotional. They were written, and writing, unlike suggestion, did not shift with convenience. The following week unfolded with a fragile politeness that felt rehearsed. Daniel kept conversations brief and practical, discussing work deadlines and traffic delays instead of property values. Linda limited her commentary to grocery lists and laundry schedules. Margaret observed the restraint without acknowledging it. She moved through the house with the same deliberate pace she had always maintained, watering the plants in the sunroom, polishing the dining table, checking the mailbox herself for the first time in months. The small shifts were subtle but intentional. On Wednesday afternoon, Margaret received a letter from the county assessor confirming the annual property valuation. She read it carefully at the kitchen table, noting the increase in estimated worth. The number did not excite her. It simply reinforced what she already knew. Stability was not defined by market trends. It was defined by ownership. That evening, Daniel approached her with a measured tone. He said they had not meant to overstep and that emotions had escalated quickly. Margaret listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked whether he had read the lease agreement recently. Daniel admitted that he had not looked at it since signing. Margaret suggested he review it again, not as a threat, but as a reminder of structure. Later that night, she heard the quiet rustle of papers from Daniel's office. The next morning, he appeared subdued at breakfast, his posture less defensive. Linda avoided the topic entirely, though her silence carried more weight than her previous enthusiasm. Margaret continued her routines. She scheduled a maintenance inspection for the heating system under her name. She renewed the homeowner's insurance herself and requested printed copies mailed directly to her bedroom address. She replaced the garage code with one she selected and informed Daniel calmly that tenants should always have clear but limited access. Each action was small and procedural, devoid of emotion, yet unmistakably firm. On Friday evening, as they prepared for dinner, Linda reached automatically for the head chair at the dining table. Margaret stepped forward before she could sit. She did not raise her voice. She did not repeat past comments. She simply placed her hand on the back of the oak chair and held it there. Daniel noticed first. He cleared his throat and gently guided Linda to the seat beside him. No one commented. Margaret lowered herself into the chair at the head of the table, adjusting her napkin across her lap with practiced calm. The chandelier cast its warm glow across the polished wood, and for the first time in weeks, the arrangement felt correct. Conversation remained light, focused on neutral topics, but something fundamental had shifted. Margaret no longer appeared as a guest navigating borrowed space. She appeared exactly as she was, the owner. After dinner, Daniel lingered by the doorway as Margaret carried plates to the sink. He said quietly that he understood now. Margaret nodded once, accepting the statement without embellishment. Outside, the autumn air cooled to 52 degrees, and the maple leaves continued to fall along the driveway Robert had sealed years ago. Inside, the house felt anchored again, not because anyone had apologized loudly or dramatically, but because boundaries had been quietly redrawn and then respected. Margaret did not need to announce authority. She only needed to sit where she belonged. By early November, the rhythm of the house had changed in ways that did not require announcements. Daniel paid his portion of the utilities on time, transferring the exact amount listed in the lease without rounding or delay. Linda no longer referred to renovations or resale during dinner conversations. Instead, she spoke about work projects and holiday plans, careful to frame every future event as tentative and respectful. Margaret noticed the adjustment but did not comment on it. She understood that true correction did not arrive with grand declarations. It revealed itself in small, consistent actions. One afternoon, Margaret invited Daniel to sit with her at the dining table after lunch. The oak surface reflected the afternoon light, smooth and familiar beneath her hands. She placed the manila envelope between them and slid it forward. Daniel looked at it, then at her, already aware of what rested inside. Margaret asked him to read one specific clause aloud, the section detailing occupancy duration and the conditions required for renewal. His voice remained steady as he spoke, though quieter than before. When he finished, Margaret asked a single question. Do you understand that agreements protect everyone involved? Daniel nodded. He admitted that he had allowed convenience and assumption to blur lines that should have remained clear. Margaret listened without interruption. She did not seek apology. She sought acknowledgement. Linda joined them a few minutes later, drawn by the unusual silence. Margaret repeated the same explanation calmly, emphasizing that structure was not punishment, but clarity. The lease was not a weapon. It was a boundary. Linda's expression shifted from defensiveness to comprehension as the words settled. She asked whether there was anything they could do to rebuild trust. Margaret answered simply, respect the terms. Ask before assuming. The conversation ended without raised voices, without dramatic gestures. That evening, Margaret walked through the house again, this time with a different awareness. The living room sofa remained in the same position, but it no longer felt staged for someone else's vision. The hallway photographs seemed brighter under the soft lamplight. Even the thermostat, set at 70 degrees, hummed with quiet predictability. Later, Daniel knocked gently on Margaret's bedroom door. He told her he had reviewed the lease entirely and realized how much responsibility it placed on him as a tenant rather than as an inheritor. Margaret regarded him with calm eyes. Inheriting required more than expectation. It required patience and earned trust. She did not elaborate further. Outside, a light rain began to fall, tapping softly against the windows and darkening the driveway in thin reflective streaks. The sound filled the house with a steady rhythm. Margaret sat in her reading chair and opened a book she had not touched in months. The words felt clearer now, easier to focus on. She understood that authority did not need to be displayed loudly to be effective. It only needed to be consistent. In the quiet space between pages turning and rain falling, Margaret felt the balance return. Not because she had forced it, but because she had reminded everyone, including herself, where stability truly began. Winter settled gradually over the neighborhood, frost tracing delicate patterns along the edges of the front windows each morning. Margaret woke early as she always did, the house still and balanced around her. The tension that once lingered in the hallway had softened into something steadier, something defined. Daniel had adjusted to the language of responsibility. Rent was transferred on the first of each month without reminder. Linda asked before rearranging even the smallest detail, from moving a lamp in the living room to hosting a friend for coffee. The difference was not dramatic. It was disciplined. One evening in December, Margaret stood once again at the head of the dining table as they prepared for a small holiday dinner. The oak chair remained exactly where it belonged. Daniel set the plates carefully, glancing toward his mother for quiet confirmation. Linda placed a folded napkin at Margaret's setting with deliberate respect. No one referenced the past weeks. They did not need to. The air carried a new understanding. After dinner, Daniel lingered in the dining room while Linda cleared dishes. He looked around the room slowly, taking in the framed photographs, the worn edges of the rug beneath the table, the faint scratch on the wall near the thermostat where he had once bumped it with a toy truck decades ago. He said softly that he had begun searching for a place of their own, closer to his office downtown. Not because he felt pushed, but because he finally understood what it meant to build something independently. Margaret listened without interrupting. She did not smile widely or offer grand approval. She simply nodded once. That night, as snow began to fall lightly across the driveway, Daniel and Linda sat with Margaret in the living room and discussed a timeline that respected the lease terms. They would complete the remaining months and transition in early summer. The agreement was calm, practical, mutual. No raised voices. No assumptions. Margaret felt something settle inside her that had been unsettled for weeks. It was not triumph. It was clarity. A few days later, Margaret stood alone in the dining room once more. The chandelier reflected softly against the polished wood. She placed her hand on the back of the oak chair, feeling its familiar strength beneath her palm. She thought about that earlier evening when she had been told she could stand. She had stood then, not in defeat, but in observation. Now she sat down slowly, smoothing her cardigan across her lap. The house was quiet except for the gentle ticking of the clock and the faint hum of the heating system set to 70 degrees. Outside, the maple trees stood bare against the pale winter sky, steady and rooted. Margaret understood something simple and lasting. Ownership was not loud. Authority did not require shouting. Respect was not granted automatically, but it could be reclaimed without cruelty. It only required patience, documentation, and the willingness to sit where one belonged. The chair at the head of the table remained filled. And this time, no one questioned why.